Hello and welcome back to the channel. We'll be doing Simple History's 5 largest armies in the world. I bet Russia, China, probably North Korea. They'll probably all be in here. Most because they'll have conscription. Possibly Turkey as well.
NordVPN, the 5 largest armed forces
India
in the world.
As well.
When World War II ended, the world entered an age known as the Long Peace, a 77-year period that saw no large-scale clashes between the major powers. However, the fact is that during this period, there was always a conflict going on somewhere in the world. During all these years of peace, the Cold...
Well, yeah, this is just a Cold War. So you had the Angola, you had Iraq, you had the Turkey incident, you had the Bay of Pigs even, Vietnam, Korea. So yeah, there was a lot of fighting, just no major superpowers involved.
War between the East and the West held the world constantly on the brink of a total all-out war. Around the world, armed forces were building up their strength, while the major powers became the superpowers with arsenals of unimaginable proportions. Even when the Cold War ended in the late 20th century, a fragile peace remained over the planet. Some new military powers emerged to challenge the balance of the established powers.
And 2 years later, well, not 2 years, but I count the end of the Cold War about 1999, just because that's when tensions kind of simmered down a bit. It was about 2 years until the Afghan and Iraq war started.
The race in armament production and the building up of military strength continued, and in the second decade of the 21st century, the world's armies have grown to a level never seen before in history.
Russia's army has actually decreased since the war for one reason: people have been defecting much more than before. In fact, I thought North Korean army figures are going to be a little screwed, but skewish, but last time I checked, I thought they had 3 million in their army. Because that was about 10% of their whole population.
Out of a world population of 7.9 billion, 20.1 million men and women are engaged in military service. That's 0.25% of all the people in the world that are carrying arms. Each of the largest top 5 armies in the world has more than 1 million soldiers on active service. This is who they are. At number 5, the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation.
Now, since the war, a lot has happened, but I think they've actually gone down in the number of soldiers compared to a lot of other places, just because of the defectors and the surrenders and the amount of people just killed by the Ukrainian counter-strike that's just happened.
With 1,014,000 active personnel, the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation rank number 5 on our list. The successor of the famous Red Army, the current Russian armed forces were established in 1992 after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. For years, the army had struggled to survive the economic transition brought on by the democratic changes in the country.
Well, yeah, and they still are. The democratic changes are still happening, but it's just turned into a dictatorship now.
The new Russian military inherited almost the entire...
And by that, I mean a militaristic dictatorship.
...their arsenal from the Soviet period, which made the Russian army, even though the second most powerful, poorly equipped compared to its main rival, the United States. However, after the 2008 reform, the Russian armed forces have undergone a profound reorganization and...
Well, yeah, they've got modernized weapons, but now the war they're using actually old Soviet missiles, which are becoming very inaccurate. And I think it was a few months ago, they almost hit Poland. Not Poland. Yeah, Poland.
Modernization of their arsenal and equipment. In 2010, the Russian government allocated over $650 billion to procure new weapons and equipment for all the branches of their armed forces. As a result, the Russian military budget in 2021 was the 4th highest in the world, worth $61.7 billion. They comprise 3 main branches: the ground forces, the Navy, and the aerospace forces. Apart from these, there are 3 independent arms of service: the Airborne Army, Special Operations Forces, and the Strategic Rock
Muscle right now, but we're gonna pull out the piano. We're on stage 3 of our body altar. Oh my gosh, 155.
Rocket Forces. Despite the attempts to professionalize the active personnel, more than half of the Russian armed forces consist of conscripts.
Well, yeah, conscription is a legal requirement unless you've been passed by the government after you've been to university. If you go to university, or straight after school if you don't. I think actually university's mandatory, I forget.
Conscription is obligatory for all Russian male citizens aged 18 to 27, with their term of service lasting 12 months. Although the Army lost its role as the global superpower after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it still holds the title for having the second most powerful force in the world, primarily thanks to its frightening arsenal of weapons and equipment.
Yeah, the first now tends to be Ukraine. I'm joking. Russia has gone down by far. It's even worse than Ukraine, who has, I think, just over 100,000 army personnel actually fighting right now.
The Russian army has the largest tank fleet in the world. Its ground forces are equipped with 12,420 tanks, mostly modernized T-72B3, B3M tanks, but also T-90Ms and T-80 BVMs. 30,122 armored fighting vehicles, including the BTR-82AM infantry fighting vehicles, 6,574 self-propelled artillery guns,
Oh, I can't tell you the modern numbers anymore,
7,000
because it just changes every second right now.
571 towed artillery guns, and 3,391 rocket projectors, mainly the BM-30 Smerch and BM-21 Grad systems. Russian air power consists of 4,173 aircraft, of which there are 772 fighters and 739 attack aircraft. Accent given on modern types such as the Su-35S, Su-30SM, and Su-30.
But a lot of them were built during Soviet times, a lot of these aircraft, because they just didn't have the money once the Federation was created, and they're now going through and now the entire world is going through an economic recession.
War. In addition to this, the air fleet also has 440.
And all the helicopters and planes that they are showing are Soviet. You can tell because it has a Soviet star on it.
5 transport aircraft, 522 trainers, 32 special mission aircraft, 20 tankers, and 1,543 helicopters, which includes 544 attack helicopters. At sea, the Russian Navy deploys 1 aircraft carrier, the famous Admiral Kuznetsov, alongside 11 frigates, 15
I think the UK has 4 actual aircraft carriers. They have what?
destroyers, 86 corvettes, 49 mine layers, 59 patrol vessels, and 70 submarines, including the most modern Yesen-M missile-armed nuclear-powered submarines. The crown of the Russian Armed Forces arsenal is its inventory of 6,257 nuclear warheads. Of that, 1,458 warheads are strategically deployed.
And they're now threatening to use them for nuclear war, but a lot of them have gone out of date.
On ballistic missiles, 4,497 are held in strategic reserve, making Russia one of the 2 leading nuclear powers in the world.
With the USA.
At number 4, the Korean People's Army. With a mighty force of 1.2 million active personnel, North Korea is considered one of the biggest threats to international security by the United States and its...
Well, yeah, look at the fact of the missiles being shot over Japan right now. They're a massive threat. And it's the first time in, I think it's 70 years, that a air raid siren has been set off in Japan.
allies. The nuclear outlaw North Korea has invested almost all of its resources into building a strong military to guard the north of the Korean peninsula from the capitalist invaders of the United States and South Korea. According to the country's constitution, national defense is the supreme duty and honor of citizens. Citizens shall defend the country and serve in the armed forces as required by law. Indeed, 36%.
This is also men and women, and I think it's 37% of their population is in the army, actually.
Of North Korean population comprises the manpower available for military service. Out of all the armed forces in the world, the Korean People's Army has the longest term of conscription, amounting to 10 years service. All males aged 14 are conscripted, starting their actual service at 17. Postponing their service is possible for those who continue their education, but only for a 3-year period. Females too are conscripted, although selectively. The ratio of men to women.
Yeah. So you also have to think of the fact that a lot of the women will not be in the army, but they're just there to make them look equal.
Conscripts is 9-1. Children of the political elites are exempt from doing military service altogether.
Ready? Grab your guitar, get
I
musician,
love
and let's play.
Metallica, but not like this.
Even though it's one of the poorest countries in the world, North Korea allocates enormous funds into maintaining its armed forces. The military budget of $1.6
Yeah, that
billion makes up
1.6 billion, right, doesn't go to food. They get barely any food. They live off the land almost, but not in a good way, or they steal. Their accommodation has no heating, no air conditioning, no proper bed, no ventilation, and they're prone to disease. And most of them will die in their first year.
a staggering 15.9% of the central government spending. Distributing this amount of money is necessary to keep the gigantic military machine functioning. The Korean People's Army has 5 service branches: the Ground Force, the Naval Force, the Air and Anti-Air Force, the Special Operation Force, and the Strategic Rocket Force.
Well, yeah.
They are equipped exclusively with Soviet and Chinese origin weapons and domestic production modifications. As a result, most of the weapons and equipment are obsolete. The ground
Well, yeah, you also have to think that they don't have much resources from the outside world, and so they just have to deal with technologies which they've had for the past up to 70 years.
forces are equipped with 5,895 tanks, mainly the old Soviet T-54s and 55s, T-62s, T-72s, and an unknown number of the new prototype M2020 tanks.
But they have never been used, and probably will never be used because they're, as far as we are aware, rubbish.
The Army also possesses 4,114 armored vehicles, mostly Soviet BTR-60 PBs, 450 self-propelled artillery, 250 towed artillery, and 1,360 rocket projectors. For air
And their air is very limited as far as we are aware. We never actually see many war planes lift off.
combat, the North Koreans have 946 aircraft, comprised of 458 fighters, which are mainly obsolete Chinese copies of the Soviet MiG-17, MiG-19,
And the old Chinese knockoffs are probably some of the worst ones which are still used by North Korea.
MiG-21, 114 attack aircraft, 1 transport, and 169 trainers. This also includes 204 helicopters, of which 20 are attack helicopters. Interestingly, the North
And they have 1 transport vehicle. That is air. At all.
Korean air fleet comprises 80 American MD-500 light helicopters illegally bought by circumventing U.S. export controls.
Well, yeah, they did that with Swiss cars at one point. Oh. Bother.
Even when the Cold War ended in the late 20s,
I found a game for buddies. Basically, you need to control the ball with your finger, or telekinesis. and finish the race first.
69 trainers. This public networks
There
and
we
being
go.
online doesn't have to mean being on. No matter where you VPN account and your plan, plus, even though it only has the third largest
Oh,
military
yeah.
in the world with 1,390,000 active personnel, the United States Armed Forces are undisputedly the world's leading military superpower. The U.S.
Okay, but when was the last time you were on a war? World War Two. Okay? Well, yeah, World War Two. Okay. When was the last time the UK won a war? With, I think, 100,000 troops at most. 1984.
gained this status during and after World War II, and especially during the Cold War. Between 1945 and 1991, the American military and political domination in the world was matched only by the Soviet Union and its Red Army. However, once the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the U.S. Armed Forces became the sole superpower in the world. Even though the last war that the United States officially fought in was World War II, its armed forces
Exactly. Well, the last war they officially fought in was also Afghanistan, in the end, and Iraq.
were engaged in numerous conflicts and military operations worldwide, earning its nickname, the Global Policeman. To maintain its enormous military hardware and retain its dominance, the United States paid a hefty price. The annual defense budget of $770 billion surpasses by far the budgets of all other countries. It makes up
Yeah, I think they surpass it by 10 billion. And yes, they have one of the largest armies, but Britain is one of the smallest armies of a developed country, and we are good because we specially train.
1/3 of the entire military expenditure of the whole world. Since 1973, the United States Armed Forces has been an all-volunteer professional military. However, upon Congress's approval, the President may enact the selective conscription system in case of war, with all male citizens and residents between 18 and 25 years of age required to register.
Yes.
Once in the service, conscripts are engaged into one of 6 service branches. These are the U.S.
Yeah, have you ever noticed that the United States Space Force logo looks like Star Trek Enterprise logo?
Army, U.S. Marine Corps, U.S. Navy, U.S. Air Force, U.S. Space Force, and U.S. Coast Guard. Combined forces of all branches are organized under unified combatant commands based on the area of responsibility in the world or on a functional basis.
Oh yeah, the Space Force was put in 2019, so they don't have that many people, and it's very
Currently,
hard
there
to get
are
into.
11 unified combatant commands. In recent years, the United States Armed Forces' dominance has been challenged by other armies, especially the rising powers such as Russia, China, and India.
Well,
To countermeasure against their efforts, the United States pays a lot of attention to the procurement of new weapons and equipment. The United States Armed Forces therefore have some of the finest and latest generation weapons and systems in its arsenal.
Well, they created much of the weapons that the world now uses.
The number of systems in service also puts the Americans at the very top of the world's military forces. Their ground forces are equipped with 6,612 tanks, with the M1 Abrams being the main battle tank. 45,000
Well, the M1 Abrams weigh several tons, but can go up to 45 miles an hour.
193 armored vehicles, including the M2 and M3 Bradley fighting vehicles, M1120 Stryker, and M113 personnel carriers, and others. The artillery consists of 1,498 self-propelled artillery guns, 1,339 towed artillery guns, and 1,366 rocket projectors. The U.S. Air Fleet is undoubtedly the mightiest force in the world with the number of aircraft it has in service. It includes 13,246 aircraft of various
Which is actually quite a lot, and it has, I think, the most aircraft carriers out of every country in the world.
types, 3 times more than the second largest air force, the Russian Aerospace Force. Of that number, 1,957 are fighters, mainly the F-15C-E Eagles, the F-16
Well, yeah, the F-16s, but I didn't think the Eagles would be that high up on there.
C-D Fighting Falcons, and their modern replacement, the F-35A Lightning II.
Yes, but the F-35s aren't used too much because they're quite new.
In addition to this, there are 783 attack aircraft and other heavier bombers. The air fleet also comprises 982 transport aircraft, 2,661 trainers, 774 special missions aircraft, 627 tankers, and 5,463 helicopters, including 910
5,000 helicopters, that's a lot more than I expected.
and attack helicopters, mostly AH-64 Apaches.
Ugh.
Hey, Wales. With YouTube Premium, there are no ads.
At sea, the U.S. Navy has 11 aircraft
Yes, it's
carriers
very
and 9
expensive.
helicopter carriers, the largest such fleet in the world.
There we go.
Together with 92 destroyers, 22 corvettes, 68 submarines, including 14
submarines.
ballistic
That is-
missile submarines, 8 mine layers, and 10 patrol vessels. Alongside the Russians, the United States Armed Forces have the largest nuclear arsenal with 5,550 warheads. A quarter
That is the they are the unclassified ones, though.
of these are strategically deployed on ballistic missiles in the United States and U.S. bomber bases across the globe. With such a powerful arsenal, it's clear why the U.S. Armed Forces are considered the most powerful military in the world. At number 2, the
India.
Indian Armed Forces.
They kind of need a large army to kind of defend all their borders,
India
especially the one with China.
is the second most populated country in the world and accordingly has the second largest military with 1,450,000 active personnel. It is, however, the fastest growing military
Yes.
with 22,768,619 men reaching the age to serve in the military annually. The military was formed on the basis of the British Indian Army from the colonial period. After India gained its independence in 1947, the army was split between India and Pakistan. It gave birth
And then the Pakistan one divided with Bhutan.
to the Indian Armed Forces. Over the years, India has forged its military strength in several conflicts with the neighboring countries of Pakistan and China. Today, the military has 3 basic service branches: the Indian Army, the Indian Navy, and the Indian Air Force, which are supported by the Indian Coast Guard and paramilitary organizations
Well, yeah, you have the paramilitary organisations which actually employ some of the most men. I
and
don't
various
think women can actually serve in the army.
inter-service commands. Due to its large population of 1.3 billion people, India doesn't practice conscription, even though there's a provision for one in their constitution. The Indian Armed Forces is an all-volunteer force,
Yes.
gathering new recruits at recruitment rounds.
Which is extremely rare for countries with volunteer armies to be that high.
All males aged between 17 and 21 may join the Army if they meet the health and physical criteria. Women are not actively recruited for the service, but they are allowed to serve as officers and combat pilots through the Short Service Commission. With its foreign activities, India has developed a strong relationship with almost all of the leading powers in the world. They've conducted joint military
Except China. China. The one person they should they probably need to get along with, they can't.
exercises with the United States, Russia, China, Japan, Brazil, and France. Similarly, India has established solid connections to procure weapons and equipment for its armed forces. As a result, they are one of the largest importers of defense equipment,
Yes.
most of this coming from Russia, the United States, France, and Israel. However, recently India has conducted a campaign to build its own domestic defense industry, and so reduced its dependence on foreign imports.
Which, if cut off, will destroy their army.
One of its leading domestic products is the Arjun Mark I tank, which is the main battle tank in its fleet of 4,614 tanks. Most of the other tanks used are Russian T-90s and T-72s. Indian ground forces are equipped with
They have some A1 Abrams.
12,000 armored vehicles, mostly the BMP-2 2K, 100 self-propelled artillery, 3,311 towed artillery, and 1,338 rocket projectors, mostly Russian Smerch 9K-58 MBRLs.
So yeah, it's all they really
The air
have.
power of the Indian military includes 2,182 aircraft. 564 of these are fighter planes, the Sukhoi Su-30 Mk-1 being the primary fighter in the fleet. That also includes the French Dassault Mirage
Yeah, the French kind of supply most of their air force.
2000 and the Indian Hal Tejas. In addition to this, there are 130 attack aircraft, 253 transport planes, 353 trainers, 71 special mission planes, 6 Ilyushin IL-78 tankers, and 805 helicopters, of which 37 are attack helicopters, mainly the Mi-25, Mi-35, and Indian Hal Rudra. The Indian Navy is among the top 10 navies in the world, with
Well, yeah.
295 vessels.
But then so is the UK Navy with... They talk about... On this, they talk about sheer numbers, when in fact you should think of more... Like, yes, this is largest, not most powerful, but again, with largety, the capacity which they can hold.
India is one of the few countries with an aircraft carrier in its fleet, the INS Vikramaditya, a modified Russian Kiev-class ship, and another undergoing trials. The Indians also have 10 destroyers, 13 frigates, 22 corvettes, 128 patrol vessels, and 17 submarines, including the nuclear-powered attack submarine INS Chakra, leased from Russia.
Well, yeah,
Being
they
one of the
are
nuclear powers,
power.
India is believed to have 156 warheads and has developed systems for launching nuclear weapons from the land, sea, and air. The nuclear weapon program is developed primarily as a deterrence strategy against neighboring Pakistan, India's main adversary. At number 1, the Chinese...
We all knew China will have that, have the largest.
People's Liberation Army. The People's Liberation Army, or PLA, was founded in 1927 and took its present form in 1947 after
Yeah.
the Chinese Communist Party took control of the country. For many years, it's had a massive but cumbersome and obsolete military force. However, in recent years, China has undertaken some serious efforts in modernizing its military, so that it has now become
Yeah, it's become modernized, but again, Russia's army has become modernized and they're being pushed into Russia from Ukraine.
the largest military force globally, with the second highest budget and third strongest armed force
Oh, and they also have mandatory conscription
in the world.
and a militaristic communist government.
As a result, the Chinese armed forces have expressed a clear indication that it intends on becoming a new superpower.
But then the Soviet Union did kind of help them.
The active personnel in the Chinese forces combined numbers 2 million servicemen. Military service is obligatory for all Chinese males from the age of 18. Teenagers are required to register with the Central Military Commission recruitment body. However,
I think by the age of 17 they should be there.
mandatory recruitment has been abandoned in China since 1949, as the armed forces have a sufficient number of volunteers to maintain the
Well,
service.
yeah.
The Chinese armed forces consist of 5 branches: the ground force, the navy, the air force, the rocket force, and the strategic support force. In addition to this, the country's entire territory is divided into 5 theater commands that are responsible for the development of tactics and response to threats or crises. Like the rest of the country, the military is under the strict control of the Chinese Communist Party. The PLA even has its members in the national parliament.
Well, yeah, they have members in the national parliament, but it's because without the army, the country would fall.
The backbone of the regime, the armed forces are granted a substantial military budget of $250.2 billion. Most of the budget is aimed at purchasing modern weapons and equipment to compete with the other leading military powers in the world. Apart from the procurement of weapons, the Chinese have invested a lot of effort and finances into developing new types of weapons, such as the laser device for tracking submarines
Well,
at
yeah.
twice the depth than the most sophisticated sonars and magnetic detectors currently can. There are also programs in developing high-powered lasers, high-powered microwave weapons, particle beam weapons, and
Which could all become illegal in a second.
electromagnetic pulse weapons. A significant step in this direction was also the development of imagery satellites for military purposes. It should be noted that in 2019, China became only the third country to have sent a man into space using only its own technology.
Yes.
Over the years, the Chinese
US,
have managed to
Russia,
modernize their
China.
arsenal to a similar level to the most developed militaries in the world. The Chinese ground forces have in their armament 5,250 tanks, 35,000 armored vehicles, 4,120 self-propelled artillery guns, 1,734 artillery guns, and 3,160 rocket projectors. Almost the entire arsenal of weapons is the product of their domestic defense industry. This includes, among others,
It started because Russia stopped helping them in the 1950s and actually became probably even their largest enemy ever.
the ZTZ-96
Well,
and
them and the US.
ZTZ-99 battle tanks, the ZBL-08, ZBD-04A, and the ZSL-92B infantry fighting vehicles, the PLZ-89 and PLZ-05 self-propelled tracked howitzers, and the PHL-8190 and PHL-03
But there's a large chance that Russia and China could unite against one country.
multiple rocket launchers. For combat in the air, the Chinese military has a fleet of 3,285 aircraft. A significant part of this fleet comprises 1,200 fighter jets, 371 attack planes, and 912 combat helicopters. The most notable aircraft are the Chengdu J-10, the Shenyang J-11 Chinese version of the Su-27, and the Xi'an JH-7 jets. In addition to this, the non-combat fleet includes 286 transport planes, 399 trainers, 114 special mission aircraft, and 3 tankers.
And you can tell that is a lot. But they have helicopters as well.
The Chinese Navy has total assets of 777 vessels, including 2 aircraft carriers, 1 helicopter carrier, 41 destroyers, 49 frigates, 70 corvettes, 79 submarines, of which 8 are nuclear and conventional ballistic submarines.
Well, yeah, the nuclear submarines were created in the past, I think, 10 years.
152 patrol vessels, and 36 mine layers. Like the other top 5 largest militaries in the world, China also possesses a nuclear arsenal. The number of warheads is top secret, but it's estimated at around 350, which makes them the 3rd most powerful nuclear force in the world.
Yep.
However, that number is likely to increase as China is determined to establish its place among the leading military forces in the world. These were the top 5 largest militaries in the world. Their active...
Anyway, that's the end of the video. So remember, like and subscribe and all that. And that's the end of the video. So bye.